Welcome to So Lounge. Today we are working with McCall's 8220, which is also called McCall's R11039. It is this Dolman sleeve top. And if you've been wondering how to cut out your pattern pieces to match stripes, stay tuned because that's what we're going to be covering today. So Lounge is the place to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got a question, leave it in the comments below and I will get back to you. So previously we had added length to this pattern. So if you did that and you were following along, just make sure that your pattern pieces are pressed so that they lie nice and flat. And if you haven't pressed them yet, but you did add length, keep in mind that tape melts and it does not have the same heat duration that paper does. So you might want to use a press cloth when you press out all these pieces to make sure they lie nice and flat. Now, I am working with this very large stripe fabric. This is a linen fabric. It is flax and cotton blend. It is a Japanese fabric, which I'm very fond of, and it's got these huge stripes. So that means I have to lay out all my pattern pieces so that I can get the front and the back to match up along the shoulder and the side as best as I can, and across the front two pieces and the back two pieces. Because remember, when we cut out this pattern, there is a seam up the center back piece. So we only have four main pattern pieces: the front, the back neck facing, and then the front facing. So we need to lay out a bunch of these pieces so that they all match up, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. Before we get started, you are going to need some marking tools. I have a pen ready to go if I need that to make any notes on my individual pattern pieces. And then you also need a tape measure. You can use a soft tape measure. And I also have a yardstick just in case I need that to measure a longer distance to make sure it lies nice and flat. I also have a little small ruler. You got a couple of different rulers that will be helpful to just go through this process. One last thing that I need to mention is make sure that all of the notches on your pattern pieces are cut out. Either cut them towards the inside and cut out those little triangles, or if you prefer to cut them away from the triangle so that they come out into the extra seam allowance, that's fine. However you want to do it, I have cut mine to the inside. The reason they need to be cut is because we're going to be using them to match up the different parts of our stripes, and that's going to help us figure out where we need to place these different pieces so that everything looks good and lines up once we sew it all together. So once you've got all of your supplies and you have your pattern pieces ready to go, we are going to check out the layout instructions, which we're not following 100%, but this will kind of give you an idea of the different things we need to do when we lay out our fabric. Let's go in for a closer look. So we are looking at the flat cutting layout for top B. Even though we're not making top B, this is the layout that's going to be most similar to what we're doing here today. So my fabric is 60 inches wide and it does have nap, which means I'm going to be cutting it on a single thickness with the selvage on each side of my table to make sure that I can get all of this pattern matched up so that all the pieces will look good once they're connected all together and the pattern will match. Now, if you don't know what nap is either the direction of the texture on a fabric. So think about corduroy or velvet where they have like a pile that's going in a certain direction. You want all the pieces to be going in the same direction. So if it's smooth down and rough up, that's what you want to do. Or in this case, this is a design nap. So you can see that these birds are all going up and these leaves are going up. We want to make sure that that panel looks the same all the way around. So we don't want one panel with the birds going down and then some with them going up. So that is what we're going to be doing, is making sure that we get all of our pieces laid out so that we can match up the print. And that would be nap, a certain type of nap. Now, the other thing to note is when you look at this pattern layout, we are going to be flipping the various pattern pieces. So we will cut the right front, which will be facing up, and then we'll flip it over to cut the left front. And then we will go to the back and cut the right back panel, flip it over and cut the left back panel. Now that's going to take care of the body of the shirt, but then you also have the front facings, which will be sewn to this front edge of the front shirt panels. And we have to cut 2 right side up and 2 right side down because of the way we're going to construct this. We need 1 for each side of the panel, so we're going to want to match the print kind of as best as we can along this line for the left front and along this line for the right front, just for 1 of each. And then same goes for this back neck facing that will go around the back of the neck, because it will be along the pattern of the stripes going down. We will need to make sure that 1 of them at least is going to match up as best as we can. The other one will be on the inside of the garment, so it won't matter. Same with 1 of each of these facings. It'll be on the inside of the garment, so we don't have to stress so much about that one. One other thing to note is that when we are matching pattern, we're going to be using these little notches to help us and line those up with certain elements of the print on the fabric so that then we can duplicate that same thing on the other side. By matching these notches from the front to the same position they connect with on the back, you know that those pieces will match up because that is where the actual pieces need to go. And so if we match the pattern at this point, that means that the pattern will match once we put everything together for sewing. And that is the same regardless of what kind of a pattern you're using. So that's just a good tip to keep in mind. One other thing is I have drawn the grain lines very long on my entire pattern, so they go the entire length of the pattern piece. That is just going to help us get everything lined up. My fabric is on grain, and I am going to be lining up this grain line with one of these main stripes to just kind of get started. And that is what we're going to do next. So to get started, make sure that your grain line is marked along the front panel. We are starting with the front panel because it's just going to be the easiest way to conceptualize this and follow these stripes all the way around the garment. Now, as I mentioned, once you have that grain line drawn on, we want to get it lined up with one of these lines on our fabric print. And I'm going with this big pink stripe with the lighter pink stripes through it. And at the same time, we want to make sure that our pattern piece is not hanging off past the selvage. Now, my selvage has printed writing in it. It has the brand of fabric and then where it's made and who it's for, and there's some Japanese written over here. So I want to make sure that my pattern piece is slid over enough so that that corner edge is not going to have any writing on it. Even though we'll be finishing that sleeve, I just don't want to risk it. So take your pattern piece and get it lined up. If you have fabric that has smaller stripes, this will actually be a little bit easier to do because you'll have more stripes to line up on. So the center front and the front grain line is one of those places that's really important because that is the part of your garment that everybody's going to see. And so we are going to start there. Once everything is lined up, then I'm going to grab some pins and put a couple of pins in here along the grain line to just hold this in place. And then I'm going to measure and just double check that everything is staying on grain. Now, this fabric is linen and it is a printed fabric. That means that the fabric print is really on one side, and when you look at it from the back, you can see that it doesn't go all the way through. It's not a woven print. The other thing that's interesting about this print is that it's not printed, the repeat is not printed evenly. So the repeat is this gray stripe, which you can see up here, then the purple with the polka dots, then the pink stripe, and then it's the birds, and then it repeats. But if you look over here, it started with the pink stripe. And if you look to this side of the fabric, it ends with the birds. So it's not evenly printed. It doesn't start with the gray stripe and then go through and go through and go through. But we do have the repeat over here, and then the third time it repeats is going to be here. So the reason we need to know that is because we need to make a decision about how we're going to put this together and where the print is going to go. So next is going to be to measure over here to the selvage and just double check that this is all the same. So that's 21 inches. That is 21 inches. So we are good as far as the fabric being printed on grain. So the print of the fabric, when the ink was applied, it was done on grain. Sometimes if you are dealing with a cheaper printing process, your print may not line up exactly with the grain of your fabric. And the problem with that is that once you start cutting it, you're going to notice that when the lines of the print aren't exactly straight. But we don't have that problem here, so we're good to go. The next piece that I want to cut is going to be the front facing that is going to lie along this front edge of this specific front panel. So this is when it starts getting a little bit more complicated, but if you follow along, you can do this with pretty much any fabric. Now, one other thing to note, if you look at these two pieces together, you will notice that this facing is smaller than the front panel. And if you line up the curve, you're going to be like, there's a couple of inches missing up here, and there's some inches missing down here. Here's the thing. At the top, we're going to be adding this back neck facing that's going to go around the back of the neck. So that's going to account for this piece up here. But if you look at your pattern, between these two large dots, it says gather. So this part of the pattern is going to be gathered to kind of create a little gather across the bust, and that will make everything fit once again, once we get those gathers in. So if you look at the pattern pieces, C is the best version to see. You can see that there's this little gathers there right in the middle of the top, and that is how we're going to make those two pieces fit together. Now, what we want to do is make sure that the notches match up, because that is where we need to make sure everything matches, because that's where we're going to sew the facing to the front panel. So that's where we want it to match. And if we match there, then everything else will match. So I'm coming up between this leaf pattern here. So I'm just going to pull it over a little bit because we know we have to put in a seam, and I know I need to cut this piece. And if I don't pull it over a little bit, they're not going to, they're going to overlap, which we don't want. So I'm going to just put a couple of pins in here, and I kind of messed up. I forgot about the tape and I put my iron on this, and so it kind of crinkled up my pattern pieces a little bit, which is why I told you not to do it. So just be careful if you have to iron everything. The tape does melt and I kind of have a little bit of a mess, but we're going to work through it, so it won't be a problem. And next I'm just going to measure the grain line on my fabric on the pattern piece, and then get everything lined up so that it's where it needs to be. And then we will be ready to move forward with this panel. Once you've finished measuring and making sure that your facing grain line is matched up with the edge of your fabric, and that the notches are matched in the pattern of your fabric, so that you know that when you sew everything together, the print is going to be the same on both of those pieces, you have to decide if you're going to cut out these two pieces or if you're going to trace around them before moving them over to cut the left front and the left front facing. So we need to flip these pieces over. To do that, we need to make a decision, and I am going to cut mine out. The tracing thing is not working great with this fabric, so depending on the type of fabric you're using, you may have more or less success than I'm having. If you are going to trace it, just make sure that you put the chalky side of your paper down, and then you just use a tracing wheel, go around the edge of your pattern. Make sure you transfer all the marks to your pattern before you remove your pattern pieces, because we do have some dots that we're going to need to gather between, and then we also need to attach the facing in certain points. So all that information needs to be transferred. If you are going to cut, that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get started over here on this edge. And then once this first piece is all cut out, I am going to transfer my marks. Actually, let's do that right now. Since you have to transfer marks either way, we may as well do them right now. And that's the same for all of them. So I'm going to just take this pin out here because we do have these large dots on the front. I'm just using this ballpoint pen that doesn't have a point in it to just draw the circle and get it to transfer. It needs to be a little darker. That way I'm also not tearing up my paper, so something to consider there. And then down here, there's a little mark for A and B. Since we are making A, even though it is shorter, I'm just going to put this dot here just because I don't know what that's going to be for. And then there's another dot down here at the bottom. This may be the dot for C. I don't know, but I'm just going to transfer the mark. And then last, there's another dot up here on the top. So we want to mark that. This, I believe, also corresponds with the mark on the facing. Then we're going to go over to the facing. There is a triangle up here near the top of the facing, near that notch. So be sure you go and transfer that, because that's going to be for something. I think that might match with the side seam once we get that to that step and get that all put together. And this is not marking, so I need to press a little bit harder. Okay, that's in there. Let's do these circles here, because we already did the other ones on the top of the shirt. And then the little dots at the bottom. Now, one thing you do need to mark on the facing is also that center front line. Remember, there are button marks on that. So we need to trace that center front line. This is when a tracing wheel is going to come in handy. So let me just slide this under here. Get that whole center front line all marked. And then I'm going to put in my buttonhole markings. And this will keep everything nice and lined up for when we get to that step of matching the center front and putting the buttonholes on. And then we have to put the buttons on, and you need all of those markings to be able to do that. So just continue transferring all the markings to your individual fabric pieces before you cut or before you trace, whichever decision you are going to go with, and then we will move on to the next step. So I have my right front facing cut out. I have my right front panel cut out. And I'm just going to pull these off to the side. I'm just going to put them on my chair over here. And next I am going to move my fabric down the table so I have some more space to do some cutting. And there's a lot of stuff over here, so bear with me. Once we've got the first parts cut out, we have some more decisions to make about the way we want to finish the front panel of the shirt. Now, as I mentioned, these stripes are not an even repeat across the entire fabric. So that means that we have to decide what we want to be on the front, how we want to do the front of the panel, because we can either keep it the same with the birds in the middle, or we can move it over a little bit so it continues with the pattern of the stripe along the left front facing, and then go back towards this side of the fabric. So it's kind of up to you. That's the whole point of sewing, being able to create your own unique designs that nobody else has. So that is the fun part of this. And this is one of those areas where your personal creativity and your personal style all come into play because you're the one cutting it out. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. The way I'm showing you is just the way that you can do it. You can do it however you want. So if you're like, yeah, Tony, I don't really care, and I'm just gonna put my pattern pieces out, hope for the best, you can totally do that too. This is just my personal preference. So this is going to be the right front panel. As you can see, this is what we are looking at. Obviously, this will be a little bit smaller. There will be seam allowances on all these sides, but this is kind of going to give you an idea of this is what the right front panel is going to look like. And I think it looks really cool, and that's one of the reasons I chose this fabric, because I thought this top would look really cool in this fabric. So I'm just going to put my right front piece over here on the side so I can refer to it if I need it. And I'm going to flip my pattern piece over. So I'm just going to lay that on this side, upside down or right side down. And now I'm going to just unpin the facing and basically just repeat this whole process with all my pattern pieces facing down. So this is where I mentioned earlier. So this is going to be the front edge, and it's just going to be about half of this width, because once we attach the other side and flip it all to the inside, it's going to be about half the width, but this is where our pattern is going to end. So if I want to continue with the birds, I'm going to have to cut my fabric lower. But if I don't, and I'm like, I kind of think it would look cool if we went back to the repeat of the stripe down the front, so that will overlap a little bit, but it's also going to look just like your fabric because the gray and pink stripe is right next to the bird. So you're just going to be continuing that same kind of motif all around your top, which is what I'm going to go with. So I am just going to line up, I'm just going to kind of leave the facing over here, and then I'm going to line up the left front piece along the edge of the pink and purple polka dots. So I've got the purple polka dots and I've got the hot pink, and I'm just kind of putting my grain line to run right down the middle of those, because I do like the polka dots and I did kind of want them to be featured in this top. So I'm just going to put in a couple of pins here. Now, since we cut off the selvage on that side of the fabric, we're going to be measuring the grain over to this side of the selvage. Since we tore the top of our fabric to get started, I got my fabric on grain before we started this entire process. So I know that my fabric's on grain. I know that my selvages are at right angles to the top edge of my fabric. And thankfully, the print pretty much lines up, or it did on the other side. So let's see if it continues across the entire width of the fabric, which sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the printing process. So let's double check. That is 24 3/4. Let's see up here. 24 3/4. So we're good. It is printed on grain, which makes our life a lot easier. Now, the next thing I want to do is make sure that this facing is going to fit with the amount of space I have left, which I think it will. So I can line it right up along this edge that I just cut. Make sure that this notch is matching up. And the thing about this notch is it's really easy. It's just in the gray section. So I just want to make sure that it is in the right place so that all of my stripes will line up. And you can use a smaller ruler for that to just make sure you can measure the inside part of your notch and make sure that they are even. That looks about right. And you know, this isn't an exact science, so if you don't get it 100% perfect, you're probably the only one who's going to notice. If you have looked at clothes in the store that are mass produced, there will be differences between them, and you may notice like, oh, that's kind of crazy how you know, that doesn't match up there, but some of them will and some of them won't, just depending on, you know, where they were cut in the giant pile of fabric. So I'm just going to get this all lined up. And ooh, that's going to be close. So my facing is coming over very, very close to the top of my piece, and I'm actually going to move this over just a tiny bit because they are overlapping a tiny bit. So there we go. Just a little bit, making sure that this piece still is going to be, you know what, I can move this up. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to keep this main piece of the front on my stripe. Keep that lined up on the grain line. And then I'm just going to pull up the other piece to match with the gray stripe, but it doesn't really matter where it matches, just as long as it matches. So we'll do that because that'll be a little bit easier, and I really like this where it is. So we just want to make sure that the notch is in the same area. So it's just a little bit down from the white line. I think that should be good. And this is just eyeballing it. So, you know, if the stripes don't match up perfectly, it's probably going to be very, very close. And I'm not going to stress about it. Because once we add on all the buttons and everything else, it is not going to be super noticeable. And basically we're just doing the same thing. So we're just going to repeat this process for the other front piece. And this wasn't too painful. So we need to transfer our pattern marks. Oops, I've got it up too far. So it's up too far at the top. I'm going to slide it down again, get everything lined up, pinned. I'm going to transfer all my marks just like we did the first time around. And hopefully we will get this all lined up where it needs to be. And things will go a little bit easier once we get this all cut out. Then comes the fun part of matching the front to the back, which is going to be slightly more complicated, but it's the same process. We're just going to be looking at the notches on different parts of the garment. So these notches are on the front panels to connect the facings and the buttonholes across the front of the garment. The next marks we're going to look at are the notches on the shoulder and under the arms, so that the front shoulder matches the back shoulder, the front side matches the back side, and it won't be too complicated. So get everything cut out and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so I have been messing with the back pattern pieces, trying to lay them out so that they will match the shoulder and the side seam of the front pieces, and it won't work. And one of the reasons it won't work is because of the repeat on the pattern and how it's uneven, and because of where I started cutting the front panels, I can't make those back panels line up at the notches unless I turn them upside down. So if I turn them upside down, I can match the back front in the gray notch, which is where it would go here, and I can put the shoulder in the purple, but then our birds are going to be upside down. So it's not really solving any problems, it's actually creating a new one. And having upside down birds is more of a design disaster, in my opinion, than having the shoulder and side seams match. So if this happens to you, you can make the choice of, do you want to flip your pattern piece to make the shoulder and underarm seam match up? Or do you want to say, okay, whatever, it's not a huge deal, which is what I'm getting ready to do. And let's make sure that we get our center back at the same point. So across the front, it looks nice and even, and we have all of our lines matched up and they look good together. And we can do the exact same thing on the back because we do have that center back seam, so we do have notches there. And that is what I'm gonna go with today. Because I don't have any other options, and just based on the width of the fabric and the size of the pattern pieces, it won't work out unless I do it this way. So we're gonna improvise. If you are working with a regular stripe fabric that is even across the whole fabric, you should not have this problem. You should be able to look at the side seams and the top shoulder seam and match those to your fabric, and you shouldn't have any problems. But since this is a more complicated stripe, even though there's fewer of them, this is what we're going to go with today. You can always default to this if matching the shoulder and the underarm seam is too complicated depending on your pattern. You can always just say, you know what, I'm going to do center front, center back. So from the front coming and going, it looks great. That's what you can do too. Remember, it's a design decision. So if something looks funky and somebody's like, hey, you know, that doesn't exactly match up right there, all you have to do is say it was a design decision and you are good to go. So my design decision today is going to be to line up the grain line with this pink line that is between the bird fabric. So I'm going to put the birds in the center back because I just really like that panel, and that's one of the reasons I bought this fabric. I'm going to get that all lined up and double check that my grain line is straight to the selvage, which it should be because we've already done this once before, but I'm just going to double check again. And then we will be good to go. Yes, it's the same. So we're just going to get that all lined up, and the back neck facing is not quite as important. We can cut that out on the scrap. We're going to put the center back line of that on the fold in the birds, and so then hopefully we get it all matched up as best as we can. And that's why I say as best as we can, because sometimes these things are easier said than done, and this is one of those instances, but it's still going to look really awesome, so I'm still excited about it. Once I have this piece all pinned down, the good news is there are no marks to transfer on the back of your pattern pieces. We just have some notches, so make sure you cut those out. I am going to just lay this out and get it nice and smooth, and then I'm going to cut it out. And then we will go on to flip the center back and cut out the other side. So I have flipped my pattern piece to keep it on that exact same line that we just cut. I am going to make sure to cut out those notches so I know that they match up exactly perfectly. My neckline matches, the notches match, everything matches. We're going to have the birds down the center back in that middle panel, and then put in some pins to just make sure everything is on grain. And we're going to measure from this side. Repeat the process. Everything should still be on grain because we already did this once, as mentioned. So that is at 23. And let's see, this is at 23, or actually 32. I'm reading it upside down. So let me just double check that and make sure I did all my math right. Yes, 32 and 32, so we are good. It's still on grain. Finish pinning this whole part, and then we will be ready to cut the next set of front facings. Now, the thing about those facings is they're going to be on the inside of your shirt, so you're not going to see them. We do still need to cut the neck facing that is going to be showing to the outside, so we do want to kind of make sure that we put it on the same place to kind of get the same pattern around that neckband, and then we will be done. So let's keep going forward. Cut out your back right panel, which should be facing up, and then we will move on to finish cutting those facings. So this is the back panel. I did put some pins in there so you can see how it pretty much matches up. I'm really happy with the way that looks. Next step is going to be to cut the back neck facing on the fold. So I have torn the grain on the bottom edge of my fabric. That is the end I was not cutting from. I was cutting from the top to get that back on grain so that now when I fold it, I know that I'm in the right spot. So for the back neck facing, I'm just going to line this up with the notches on the neckline, which is where we're going to be attaching these two pieces. And between this pink panel and the bird panel is about 1/4 of an inch. So when I line up my pattern piece on top of my fabric, I want it to overlap about 1/4 of an inch, and it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. You're just trying to do this the best you can. Remember, it's a design decision. So I am just going to cut that out, get it pinned, and then cut it out. And this back piece needs to be cut twice. So we want to make sure we do that. And I did do that right because it was backwards over there. Okay, so I did get this all in the right place. You do have a triangle on here, so be sure you do that and transfer that pattern mark before you cut the next one. So I'm just going to leave some space above this one for the next one I cut out. And I'm just going to leave it pinned for right now because I'm going to go and pin the other facing that we need to cut, which is for the front panel. Now keep in mind, this panel is going to be longer, so we want to make sure that our fabric is doubled up and that we have it in 2 layers so that we can get that whole piece cut out. And thankfully I have just enough fabric left over to do this. So I am just going to line this up on the front panel. Can I line it up with the birds? All right, so I think I'm going to line it up with the birds so that I know that piece will attach to the bird side. It'll attach to this side. And then I'm just not going to worry about the other side because you're not going to really see it. Once we put the buttons in, you're not even going to know it's there. So I'm not going to stress. And I'm going to get this all lined up so that I can cut this piece out. And remember, we do have to transfer actually we do not have to transfer the marks on these. We just need to transfer the dots and the triangles so we know where to connect everything once we get it all sewn together, because we're going to be attaching the buttonholes and the buttons to the front panels, which we have already marked. So get those all pinned and then get everything cut out. Don't forget to transfer your marks, and then we will almost be done. Once you have all of the facings cut out in your fabric, the very last step to cutting is going to be cutting out interfacing. Now, the good news about interfacing is you don't have to cut out as many pieces, so we just need 2 of the piece number 3, which is the front facing, and we just need 1 of piece number 4, which is the back neck facing, cut on the fold. So as I have mentioned before, interfacing does not have grain, so you can just kind of line up your pieces and get them all cut out. You do want to cut them out with the right side facing up. If you go back to your pattern instructions and you look at the cutting layout specifically for the interfacing, it does indicate that those should be placed face up. That means you will be able to attach them to the correct sides of their fabric counterparts. Once you get everything all lined up so that it's smooth and going to be easy to cut, just get those cut out, and then we will be ready to move on to the sewing. So now you know how to cut out fabric with stripes and how to match notches to get those pieces lined up. I am happy with the way that the center front and center back turned out, and once we get everything sewn up, it's going to look really good. A little disappointed about the shoulder and side seams, but as mentioned, this fabric is a little bit more difficult than a regular basic repeating stripe. You should have better luck when you follow these instructions with a regular stripe fabric. So if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions, leave them in the comments below and I will get back to you. Until we meet again, happy sewing!